Welcome back to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. It may come as a surprise to those who don't live here, but the foreign-born comedian scene is rocking and having a field day in Japan right now. Prime example, Patrick Harlan, also known as Pakkun, a Harvard graduate, veteran manzai comic, and the undisputed godfather of the current scene. Then there's Chad Mullane, an Aussie who moved to Osaka and delivers comedy in a Kansai dialect thicker than okonomiyaki sauce. Even Tokyo locals occasionally need subtitles. We've also got Ike Nwala, the man who walked away from Goldman Sachs to join a comedy troupe. Possibly the only person in history to look at investment banking and think, you know what this is missing? Job security. Another veteran, Atsugiri Jason, a tech executive who also turned his back on a steady career to become a successful comedian. And then there's Nick Neeson, a seasoned manzai guy from the duo Time Bomb who's become a YouTube sensation of late. I watch his videos sometimes, they're very entertaining. And finally, the one who's perhaps closest to today's protagonist, Katsura Sunshine, a Canadian who mastered rakugo, Japan's 400-year-old traditional storytelling art, and successfully exported 17th century Japanese humor to the West End and Broadway. The list goes on. Actually, there are so many more of these comedians, and every one of them perform their comedy routines entirely in Japanese to Japanese audiences, except when Katsura Sunshine performs overseas. I'd like to tell you a story of the one who started it all back in the early Meiji-era, the 1870s. So, a man's mate bets him he can't drink 15 bottles of beer in one sitting. Being a man of great confidence and no self-awareness whatsoever, he accepts. But on the way to the bet, he pops into a pub or izakaya just to check. Just to make sure he's still got it. A little warm-up. You can probably guess the plot. By the time he arrives for the actual 15 bottles, he is, of course, already too pissed to drink another bottle. He has, in effect, lost the bet by over-preparing for it. Oh well, there's a lesson to be learned for all of us there. This comedy sketch was written in Japanese for a Japanese audience in 1904 by an Australian. His name was Henry James Black, born in Adelaide, Australia in 1858. So I said he was Australian, but Australia was still a British colony at the time, so he was, at least on the day he was born, technically British. His father, J.R. Black, was a newspaperman who ran several publications in Japan. Henry didn't arrive in Japan as an adult with a phrasebook and a dream. He was brought over as a small child and basically grew up in Yokohama. And remember, this was an era just before or just after the Meiji Restoration, when majority of Japanese people wore kimono and still had that samurai hairdo. It was years before the westernization took place. It was Japan, as in Kurosawa's films. Henry's father's paper fiercely criticized the policies of the Japanese government, or Meiji government if you like, which led to its forced closure by the authorities. It's actually funny, by many accounts, under Tokugawa shogunate, de facto military regime, the press had more freedom of speech than Meiji government, which is Western-style, more democratic government. Interesting. Anyhow, disillusioned, the Black family decided to relocate to Shanghai, except the 18-year-old eldest son Henry, who chose to remain in Japan alone. So, in 1876, he was taken on by a troupe of magicians and began performing Western magic tricks under the name Ha Black. The record shows that he performed in Asakusa and Nihonbashi, and the only way was up. Or so it seemed. Performers at the time were forbidden from appearing at yose, the traditional storytelling theatres, essentially the comedy clubs of their day, without government permission. Henry negotiated directly with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and secured official permission in 1880. In other words, he greenlit his own path to becoming the king of comedy in Japan. Hooray! Alas, Henry faced fierce opposition from his family, who thought this was an undignified and unstable way to live. They've got the point there. He was temporarily forced out of showbiz and started the respectable foreigner in Meiji Japan thing instead. He opened an English language academy, taught English, and wrote a textbook. The allure of the limelight, however, proved irresistible. He began telling entertaining stories about famous European historical figures on stage, which, if you think about it, is an incredibly weird pivot. Imagine your English teacher moonlighting as a one-man historical stand-up act, performing to Meiji-era Japanese audiences who had hardly ever seen a Westerner, let alone one doing an impression of Joan of Arc. By all accounts, the audience lost their mind. Probably not so much because the material was side-splittingly funny, but because the white man was standing on the stage being funny in Japanese, and that alone was worth the ticket price. Well, some things haven't changed much. By the early 1890s, Henry took up rakugo, traditional seated one-man Japanese comic storytelling, as a full-time career move, in defiance of his family. In March 1891, Henry Black assumed the name Kairakutei Black, becoming the first Westerner ever to be officially recognized as a professional rakugo storyteller. By the way, Kairakutei roughly translates to something like pleasure hall, a stage name that sounds less like a comedy hall and more like a military's regulated morale-boosting establishment. His younger brother John apparently was so incensed by his brother's new persona, the pleasure hall, that one day he burst into one of Henry's live performances and started shouting insults at him from the crowd, calling him an embarrassment to the whole family. The only possible saving grace here is that none of the audience understood what his brother was saying, so they probably thought it was part of the act. 2 years after he assumed the name Kairakutei Black, Henry married Aka Ishii, the daughter of a confectioner in Asakusa. He was adopted into her family as a son-in-law and acquired Japanese citizenship, changing his legal name to Ishii Black, which presumably also meant giving up his British and/or Australian nationality. Basically, Henry severed ties with his entire birth family before they had the chance to disown him, and constructed a new one in Japan. From this point onwards, Henry entered a period of astonishing, multifaceted activity. He started developing performances based on Western short stories and eventually began authoring his own original material, such as the one I introduced earlier. Henry, or Kairakutei Black, gained immense popularity as a blue-eyed rakugoka, the traditional comedian, fluent in sharp Tokyo working-class Bellamy dialect, a rough counterpart of Cockney if you like. He also adopted works by Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare, probably among the earliest introduction of these British literary titans to Japanese audiences. Henry was also cast in kabuki, tutored by none other than Ichikawa Danjiro IV, one of the biggest names in kabuki history. He was said to have played a female role in kabuki. By this time, Henry, or Kairakutei Black, was one of the hottest acts in Japanese showbiz. In 1903, an American recording engineer named Fred Gaisberg, working for the British-owned gramophone company, turned up in Tokyo with a machine and a mission. Record as much of Japan's traditional performance culture as physically possible before it was too late, which was a very wise move. Over about a month, he captured well over 250 recordings. Everything from imperial court orchestras to shamisen players to, of course, comic storytellers. Kairakutei Black wasn't just one of the performers recorded. He was the fixer, the man who knew everyone, spoke the language fluently in both directions, and could talk a room full of suspicious traditional performers into standing in front of a very peculiar-looking horn-shaped machine and trusting it not to steal their soul. These recordings are widely regarded as the earliest surviving audio recordings made in Japan. Despite the muffled quality, they preserved the invaluable voices of Meiji-era comedy masters, including Henry himself. Most of them are available on YouTube. The audio quality is so poor, it's sometimes difficult to make out what they're saying, but it is an extremely fascinating listen regardless. Actually, someone ought to use a bloody AI to isolate the voice from the noise and turn it into clean audio. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody had already done it. After all, that's what AI is for, isn't it? By 1908, a mere 5 years after that historic recording session, and now 50 years old Kairakutei Black's popularity had waned and his earnings had declined. Henry attempted suicide by drinking arsenic. He survived. He lived out his later years with his adopted son, Seikichi, also an entertainer. By the way, his marriage to his first wife had only lasted 2 years. Now, adopted son often translates to a young male lover. This is something biographers have only been able to piece together more recently. By most accounts, Henry had a number of Japanese male lovers. Whether that makes Henry Black gay, bisexual, or simply a man of his era doing his own thing is genuinely hard to say with any confidence. Gay as a fixed identity is a fairly modern Western invention, and it doesn't map neatly onto how relationships between men were understood in Meiji or pre-Meiji Japan. What we can say is that intimate male-male relationships had a long, well-established and largely unremarkable place in Japanese history and society, particularly amongst samurai, where such relationships were a normal part of court and warrior culture, and amongst kabuki actors, many of whom took male lovers as a matter of course. It wasn't hidden away or treated as scandalous the way it so often was in the West at the time, or ironically, Japan today. On the 19th of September 1923, just over a fortnight after the Great Kanto earthquake, Henry, better known as Kairakutei Black, died of a stroke at his home in Tokyo at the age of 64. Although by this time he was a naturalized Japanese citizen, he was buried at the Yokohama Foreign Cemetery, a resting place that feels almost too on the nose for a man who spent his whole life somewhere between two countries, belonging fully to neither. So, a man born in Adelaide, raised in Yokohama and Tokyo, who taught English, then made Meiji-era Japan laugh in its own language, then got heckled by his own brother mid-show, then legally became someone else's son to make the point stick, then helped preserve an entire generation of Japanese performers on record before anyone else thought to. That's Kairakutei Black, the original. Well, I say original because there's another contemporary comedian who assumed the name Kairakutei Black II. This one's half American, half Japanese, born and raised in Japan, and speaks zero English. His comedy sets are as dirty as they get. Totally unbroadcastable. Well, you know why I like him also. Anyhow, back to Henry the original Kairakutei Black. The twilight years of his life were a bit of a downer, and today he is largely forgotten. I've been endlessly fascinated by his roller coaster of a life, and everything he achieved in it. And although hardly anyone remembers him anymore, I have no doubt in my mind that Kairakutei Black was the man who paved the way for the foreign-born comedian phenomenon booming in Japan today. So, I'd like to think Henry's comedy genes are still very much alive in those contemporary comedians. And that, I think, is his epitaph. On that note, this has been Puss Whatever. If you found any of that remotely useful, which I strongly doubt, or at least mildly diverting, which is a very distant possibility, do consider liking and subscribing. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, stay safe and stay away from arsenic. Yeah, it's alright. It's not that funny, but...